So with that, I will go ahead and get started, and we're going to learn about kind of North American sheep. There are a lot of wild sheep around the world. We're going to focus on North America, and we have 4 different species: the Dall sheep, the desert bighorn, the Rocky Mountain, and the stone sheep. But those are broken up into 2 different categories. We have the bighorns, and then we have the thinhorns. And you don't hear a lot about thinhorn sheep as much as you do about the bighorns, and it's probably because we have bighorn sheep where we live, not necessarily the thinhorn. So when you break those up, the Rocky Mountain bighorn, we do have some of those in Nevada, about 300. And the desert bighorn, we have a lot of those in Nevada, more than any other state. The thinhorn, those are going to be found further north. And they're called thinhorns because they still have big horns, but they're much thinner versus the bulky girth of the bighorns. And you'll get a chance this afternoon to see some skulls and reproductions, or there's some nice sheep, and you'll see the difference between those thinhorns and bighorns. Starting with the Rocky Mountain, it's really named for their massive, massive horns. If you've seen commercials for like Dodge Ram, the emblem on the Dodge Ram is the Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep. If you were to stretch out their horns, a big one can be 50 inches. And you know, if you know your yard, a yard is 36 inches. So that can really kind of be a pretty big bighorn. There's about 48,000 we estimate with our most recent science, and they live in pretty much the Rocky Mountains of North America, from northern Mexico all the way up to southern Canada. Current world record died in 2016. We actually have a reproduction. This is a reproduction of the skull, and it's over here. So this afternoon, it's definitely something to look at. Of all the bighorn sheep that are Rocky Mountains, this is the biggest one. It died on an island that was stocked with bighorn sheep in the early 1900s, and it really has no predators, except for a mountain lion somehow got on the island, must have swam there. So there is a mountain lion on the island now, but they had no predators for a long time, and it was the Fish and Game's stock reserve. As the sheep would do well, they would capture them from the island and move them to other places to help reestablish their herds. And it was only 9 years old, so something with the minerals or the content in the DNA just made it pretty big. The horn and skull together weigh 48 pounds, and that's the weight of an average kindergartner. This is my daughter last year when she was a 3rd grader, and she weighed about 50 pounds. And so it kind of gives a good idea there on how big and heavy that actual skull is. Desert bighorn sheep, this is what we have a lot of in Nevada. They have adapted. They can live for a very long period of time without actually drinking water. I've been told months, up to 6 months, they can get enough moisture if needed from the plants, if the moisture content is good enough in there. They're the smallest of the subspecies. They remind me of a bobblehead. They still have huge horns, but a tiny little body, tiny little neck, and that tiny body really helps them survive. It's less transpiration, it's less heat loss, and so it keeps them, when those hot months, it can keep them cooler, and they can just survive better with the smaller body mass. They live in isolated mountain ranges. There's about 37,000 of them in northern Mexico, and then a couple western states. The Dall sheep, if you talk to people who know sheep, a lot of them think that this is the most beautiful or majestic one. It's the only one that has that white fur. And just like if you think of animals that are albino, where they have lost a lot of their melanin and they have a white fur, their eyes are a little different color as well. That even in humans, there's albino humans where their skin is very, very pale, and their eyes are a very pale color. The Dall sheep's eyes are a little bit lighter color as well with that. They live only in parts of Alaska and Canada. And then we have the stone sheep, and the stone sheep is an interesting one. Colors can vary from like a chocolate brown to a gray. A lot of times they'll maybe look to me a little bit more shaggy than some of the others. About 13,000 of them, and they range only in Canada, in British Columbia and the Yukon territory up there where the last big gold rush was in the Yukon. So when we break these out, we have the thinhorns, which are up in the north there, and we have the bighorns, which are down in the south, and very separated. If you can kind of see Nevada there, you can see a lot of ranges. I'll show you a close-up of that map soon. But Nevada has been a very successful state with bighorn sheep, and it's because of all the volunteers that have helped out with bringing those populations back. So in all, about 100,000 thinhorn, about 85,000 bighorn sheep live in North America with our best scientific estimates. Here's a map of Nevada. Now, this map isn't super current. It's about 4 years old or so. A couple of these herds have died out. One of the biggest factors is pneumonia that kind of gets to the bighorn sheep. So a couple of these ranges aren't there, but there's some other ranges that we've introduced sheep into that are not on this map. And this breaks them down into subspecies. So you have your desert bighorn sheep. They're pretty much all south of the interstate from here to Salt Lake City. So if you've ever driven that interstate, everything on the right is going to be your desert bighorn sheep. And then to the left of that, the yellow, those are called California bighorn. And it's a subspecies. It's still a desert bighorn, but there's enough unique characteristics. They kind of call it a California bighorn or a Nelson bighorn. And then you have the Rocky Mountain, and those are the purples over there on the eastern part. Again, they need some of the most rugged terrain. They're in the Ruby Mountains, if you know anything about that mountain range, super steep, super rugged. And we struggle with the Rocky Mountains. We just don't have the ideal habitat for those. The population will range from low 200s to 310, 320, and then they'll get a disease outbreak and it'll drop back down. So Rocky Mountain, if you see one of those in Nevada, you're pretty lucky, but if you go to Colorado or Wyoming, that's all you see. So males and females. Does anyone know what a male or female is called in the sheep family? Colby? A ram and a ewe. You are correct, spelled differently there. So the ram and the ewe, the rams are the males. They both have horns. So unlike deer and elk, animals that have horns, those horns stay on for their entire life. They don't drop them like antlers. Deer antler falls off every single year and they grow a whole new one back. The females, though, their horns only get so long. And so you can still tell a mature ewe, that might be 7, 9, 10 years old, it's going to have a little bit longer horns than a younger one. But the rams will really start growing and building that horn growth around. It's the same material your fingernails are made out of. It's called keratin. And it continues to grow throughout their lifetime. Sheep adaptations, in order to survive in these environments that sheep live in, these a lot of times non-hospitable environments to many organisms, the sheep have adapted to live there. And their hooves are one of their greatest assets. They're hard on the outside, but on the bottom, they almost are palpable, almost like the palm of your hand. And so what that does is when they're on a ledge, they can walk on a 2-inch ledge without falling off. Can they fall off? Yeah, they can fall off, but they're very, very good at walking on very, very small crevices, and that soft part of their hoof can help wrap around a little bit. It's also a little bit like sandpaper. So there's some friction to the bottom, and that helps them grip as well. And then when you look at hooves, if I hold my hand up, I really have 4 fingers and a thumb. And so if I take my thumb away, what sheep have done, all hoofed animals, we call them ungulates, they walk on the 2 center fingers. These have come up and become dew claws. And some of you might have dogs or cats that you have to take into the vet, and the dew claws are up here, and they might have to have those removed. They're not really utilized for much. They can catch on things and get ripped and kind of bleed, and so sometimes they have to be removed. But when you look at a sheep hoof, you will see that they'll have 2 tiny little hooves sticking up here, and then these part right here, that's what they're walking on. And so with that, they can spread them out like we can as well. So they can spread them out for more surface area, or they can pull them together to have a closer surface area so they can walk on those ledges. Camouflage. So here's a picture. If you're in the back, it's going to be a little harder, but there are a couple bighorn sheep in this photo. And look through and see, kind of have an idea in your mind of how many are in here. Okay, here comes a quick hint, and then I'm taking it back away. Here it comes again. So there are more than 10 sheep in here. There are 14 sheep in this picture. And so there's a couple lambs, so they're smaller. They're a little bit harder to see. I've kind of tried circling them and then putting numbers with how many are actually in there. So I'll reverse this slide again, kind of get an idea, and now see if you can see those as easily. So camouflage helps them, right? The greatest predator is pretty much, depending on the state, wolves or mountain lions. A mountain lion will take down a deer or a sheep, about 1 a week with that. And so having a camouflaged ability can really help them. I know I've been out in Nevada, and I've heard rocks falling, and I've looked over and I've looked and looked and looked and finally saw the sheep that I even knew they were there. You could hear them walking, but they just blend in really, really well. Their hairs are hollow. So deer, elk, antelope, all their hairs, if you were to cut their hair and look under a really, really good microscope, there'd be a tiny little air pockets in there. And that works the same as our windows in our houses and our schools, where we have usually double-paned windows. So there's air trapped in between. It works the same as like a down vest or a down sleeping bag where you have feathers. The feathers don't keep you warm. It's all the air trapped in between there. And so they have their warm body. If it's really hot outside, all that air trapped in their hair keeps them cooler. If it's really cold outside, all that air trapped in their hairs keeps them warmer. And so it works the same way our windows do in our houses. And if you lived in Colorado or really cold places, you even have triple paned windows. So 3 different layers of glass with different air levels between there. Their skulls, they're known for butting heads. And if you or I ran at each other as hard as we could and hit heads, you know, we'd get a concussion at the very minimum, but we'd probably knock ourselves out at the same time. They actually have a double layer skull. And so if we look at this skull right here, their brain cavity is the big one on the right. But that cavity right there is a honeycomb structure that when the horns hit and all that energy wave goes through their horns and is heading towards their brain, it gets broken apart or dissipates in those little air pockets in there. Under their horn sheath, the horn that you see is actually bone growing out of their skull. This is a cross segment of that. So even when you cut that in half, it's very sponge-like. It's hard. It is bone, but it's sponge-like. And again, all those energy waves hit that, and it breaks it up. Very similar to these ceiling panels that you see above you. You know, most schools, most auditoriums will have panels that have holes in them like that. So the energy waves that go up there will hit those, and they kind of break apart so that it's not an echoey sound in big auditoriums. So that's just helping them not knock themselves out. They are a ruminant. This is like a cow. If you ever watch a field of cows, sometimes you'll see a cow and he's just out there just chewing. And his head never goes down, and he just chews, and he's like, is he chewing on bubble gum? What's going on there? Well, they are what are called cud chewers. So what they do is bighorn sheep can't be standing out in the open all the time. But they have to get out of their escape terrain, the cliffs and mountain ranges. Those don't provide as much protection. So they'll come off those cliffs, they'll go out, browse on their vegetation kind of quickly. They'll eat it, and a lot of what they're eating, their stomach can't digest as well. Our stomach can't digest if you're eating sagebrush as well as their stomachs. They have a 4-chambered stomach. And so they'll go out, they'll eat a bunch, and it goes into the first layer of their stomach, their first part. And then they basically head back to the mountains. They'll lay down, they'll stand up, whatever, but they're out of where predators can see them. And then they regurgitate that back into their mouth. And then they enjoy it and chew it. And then they swallow it again, and it goes back into that second chamber of their stomach. And this allows them to kind of eat quickly, get back where they need to. It lets their tough material that they're eating kind of get digested a little bit better. So here's a video that someone was able to capture. And what you'll see here is he's chewing. And you'll notice in a second he's going to swallow. You'll see a lump go down his throat. And then it'll be like a second later, and you'll see a lump come back up. So he's chewing his cud. He's going to swallow it. Here it comes. There it goes. And then another one comes back up. And he's like, man, this is good. It's like enjoying your food a second time. So next time you see cows, if you ever drive McCarran, you used to see cows on the west side of town there. Look out there, and if they're just chewing, that's what they're doing there. But there's one way that sheep haven't been able to adapt, and that is through some diseases. And so the biggest killer of bighorn sheep since humans have moved west is, they get a lot of diseases, but the current one is Mycoplasma ovipneumonia. We usually shorten it down to just MOV is how it's usually said. And it's an old world disease. So many of you have studied Native Americans, and you might know that when Europeans came over, we brought smallpox and other diseases that we would get sick back in Europe, but not usually die. And we came here, and the Native Americans would get that sickness, but it would kill them almost instantly, and it decimated a lot of the native tribes. This is an old world disease. So when we started bringing over domestic sheep, they would be sick with this sickness, but they wouldn't die. They'd get sniffles a little bit, maybe a slight little cough, and then they'd recover from it. But that disease can transfer to wild sheep, and the wild sheep will get it, and a couple of them can survive, but most of them end up dying. And a lot of those are going to be the young or the old. And so at some point, you reach this point to where there's no reproduction rates. And it can wipe out a whole entire herd in a matter of weeks. And so in the Montana range, we had a herd, this was 4 years ago, and it was just decimating them. And there were, let's say 100 sheep there, and there's another sheep herd that's healthy here. And it got down to where, 80% of this herd had died out, and they were worried that these sheep here were then eventually infect these over here. And so sometimes there's calls, Department of Wildlife have to make that call to save these 100 sheep. We need to kind of take these 20 that are left that are sick to not impact those. And then what happens is you wait some years, you go to where a population is doing well, capture some of those sheep, and then go release them back into the ranges where those sheep are. So that's a hard issue. We know the West was founded on ranching and mining. And so it's hard to say, hey, we don't want domestic sheep ranging on public land where wild sheep are. It's been a tradition of our history for a long time. So it's something that we're constantly working with to try to figure out how to resolve that issue. So there's what imovie looks like under a microscope. And then those would be the domestic sheep. And even goats, domestic goats can transfer this as well. So this is called the Youth Wildlife Conservation Experience. And so I think it's really important to talk about what conservation is. And so by now, you've been in school for a very long time. Parents might even talk to you about conserving things at home. And so we're going to start by talking about water and how you conserve water or save it, right? The purpose of conservation is so that we don't, let's say, contaminate our water, so 10 years from now, we don't have as good of clean, healthy water. We're saving it for future generations. So if you think of water, and ways that you conserve water to save it, have in your mind, what are those ways? Let's hear some. Go ahead and shout some out. Taking shorter showers. That's one. What's another one? I'm not sure I heard. The math makes it kind of hard, but you've heard these ways probably over and over, right? Turning the water off when you're brushing your teeth. If a faucet is leaking, get it fixed, because every drop, hour after hour, 24 hours a day, adds up. Watering the lawns in the morning. In Reno, we even have a mandate that when it's water time to water our yards in the summer, we have certain days that odd addresses can water and certain days that even can, just to help conserve that water. Taking shorter showers, installing particular shower heads that even reduce the water that you use, on and on and on. So keeping that in mind, like efforts to conserve resources like water, there are efforts to conserve wildlife so that as our population grows, wildlife is around for future generations to utilize, to see with that. And it's become known as the North American model of wildlife conservation. So a little bit of history here. So when early colonists arrived after Columbus landed, and they saw this land as an opportunity of resources. So many trees, they never ever thought we'd ever have an issue with lumber. There were no governmental agencies managing any of that. And so people just thought, hey, let's take and use what we need. And it wasn't a problem really in the early years, but our population continued to grow. More immigrants came in, our population continued to grow. And eventually we reached a point to where this is a graph of the non-native people, so those that not Native Americans, and that growth from 1492 when Columbus landed. So you can see for a couple hundred years, there wasn't a lot of growth, and then boom, right? 13 colonies, many of you have studied that very recently. You have this population growth take off, and at that point, people start realizing, wow, we're seeing a lot of the trees being cut down. We're seeing, when we used to go out to get, there weren't super Walmarts at that point. You couldn't go to Rayleigh's or Scolari's. You had to go find your food in the forest, and it was getting harder and harder for a lot of these people to do that. And so in the mid-1800s, it was actually the hunters and the anglers, people who fish, who realized they were the ones out there in the woods going, wow, we're not seeing antelope, we're not seeing deer like we used to, we're not seeing elk, we're not seeing bighorn sheep. And one of the most famous people is Theodore Roosevelt. He became president. He founded a club called the Boone and Crockett Club, and it was all about how we need to establish a way so that you don't just hunt as many animals as you want. The population is growing, that doesn't work anymore. So as hunters who came in and said, hey, we need to have a policy of only so many animals can be hunted based on how many are there and how many humans need that resource. The efforts merged over the last couple hundred years, and it's became known as the North American Model for Wildlife Conservation. Now, there's two basic principles. Fish and wildlife belong to all of us. Okay, that's really important. A lot of countries, even today, that's not the belief. And that wildlife needs to be managed in a way so that their populations will be around forever, not just for us to enjoy right now. And there's 7 guidelines. Somehow they came up with this called the 7 Sisters. But these 7 guidelines are principles. They're like, how do we achieve this? How do we make sure wildlife is around? And I'm going to quickly go through this. It's somewhat complex, but I think I've broken it down small enough. And the first sister, the first guideline, is that wildlife is held in the public trust. Colonists came over from England, right? And in England, it was like, you know, the land belongs to the king. You get to utilize what we say you get to utilize. And they came over here and it was very different. They didn't have to follow the king's orders as much. You know that led to the colonial revolution, right? And some of those ideas with that. And so they came over here and they had an access to hunt when they wanted to for the first time. They had an access to cut down trees, to build where they wanted to build. And they felt empowered. And they felt that we need to take care of this wildlife because no one really was in those first years there. In North America today, all of our natural resources are managed by some type of agency. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they manage our wildlife and fisheries. In Nevada, we have the Nevada Department of Wildlife. They manage our wild game and fish here. Forest Service manages our trees. Bureau of Land Management, we have over 80% public land in Nevada that is managed by the Bureau of Land Management. So those all are there to make sure those resources are around in the future. The second guideline was that, okay, we need to kind of prohibit making money off of dead wildlife. I'm going to tie this into Virginia City because many of you have been to Virginia City. That town started kind of our state. Silver was discovered, all these miners came in, and they were mining, looking for gold, looking for silver, and they couldn't go to Super Walmart to get their groceries that night. So there were people that had to fill the void. All right, miners are doing this, they're going to pay us. Let's go hunt antelope. Let's go hunt deer. Let's go hunt bighorn sheep. We'll bring that back and we'll sell it to the businesses in town. And that worked fine for a while, but when the population increased, all of a sudden that became a limiting factor. So no longer can you sell the meat of an animal. You can give it away, but that started putting in another guideline there as well. Democratic rule of law. Hunting and fishing laws are created by the public. So you all will turn 18 in a matter of years. And every month in every state, the Department of Wildlife gets together and they talk about how wildlife should be managed. And you can serve on those boards, you can go and give your opinion, and these laws are always changing and tweaking on how best to conserve wildlife based on populations, where they're growing, where they're not growing. The fourth sister is that hunting is an opportunity for all. Every citizen has that opportunity under the law to hunt and fish in the United States. And I think we just assume that that's the case everywhere, and it isn't today. There are places in the world where if wildlife comes on your property, that's your wildlife, and you can hunt it as much as you want. And when it leaves your private land, it's not yours anymore, and you can't. And so there's different ways that wildlife is managed or not managed around the world. Wildlife can only be killed for legitimate reasons. So that is, meat. If you're a hunter and you hunt the meat, I know I go elk hunting and deer hunting, and that's my chili meat, that's my taco meat. Sorry, it's my wife calling. That's my fajita meat. That is all the meat that we get really goes into that. We buy chicken, we buy turkeys, but that becomes our lasagna meat, our hamburger meat, and everything with that. And it saves us money. It's healthy meat. I know that there's no hormones added. I know that I've cleaned it well. And so you can do it for food, for fur, self-defense, right? If a bear's busting in your garage up at Incline Village and you're concerned about your safety, that would be a legitimate reason for that. Property protection. So there's laws. If you're doing it against the law, that's not hunting. That is called poaching. And that's the illegal method of taking wildlife from public lands and private lands. And this afternoon, there's an Operation Game Thief trailer kind of on the other side behind that wall, and they have all their mounts in there were all animals that were illegally taken. People not having hunting licenses, not following the rules, and not listening to science on how many animals should be harvested and killing it illegally. So the game wardens are over there, great people to talk to learn a little bit more about that. Wildlife is an international resource. A lot of the geese and the ducks that you see today flying through Reno, they don't stay here. They might fly down to Mexico, or they might fly to Canada. So that created an issue on, wait, who's managing these? You know, if we're managing them well and they go to Mexico and then they all get shot and there's no management system, that's an issue. So this was something that's kind of been created, and in 1918, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was created. And that was an act between Canada, the United States, and Mexico to say, how do we manage this different wildlife? And in 1918, you had to pay an extra penny to hunt waterfowl, birds that migrated across those borders, and that extra money went into managing those resources that were not just in the United States. Here's the duck stamp today. So a duck hunter, instead of not just paying to hunt ducks, also has to then get a hunting license plus a $25 duck stamp. And that money goes into wildlife conservation for those animals that cross the borders there. And the seventh one, the final one, is that we need to use science reasoning and science data to manage wildlife. It can't be based on emotions. We have to kind of, here's a game crossing over one of the highways in Nevada. And there was a lot of science that went in. Where are the deer migrating? Where do we need to build this? And so that scientific management is even how hunting regulations are designed. So hunters can't just go hunt anywhere. If there's a big fire in Nevada, it might be that population, the food resources got decimated, and they would reduce tags in that area. If the population is getting really high in another, and all those animals, there's not enough food for them to get through the winter, they might increase the hunting licenses in that area. It's based on gender, it's based on species, and so everything dealing with hunting is really scientific managed, as is radio collaring for game crossing zones, and that's important. So this is Carl Lackey. He'll be presenting here on stage this afternoon. He's the bear biologist for the Department of Wildlife. So we call these the 7 pillars. They didn't evolve all at once. I don't expect you to remember all of them, but it is important to understand that they do change. They have changed, and our society, continues to evolve, and the population increases. We have to keep figuring out how to best keep wildlife around for future generations. And so if we look at the definition of conservation, it's the practice of managing plants and animals and their habitat so that future generations, future kids, future adults can experience and utilize those. And that's different than preservation. If you preserve something, you are protecting it, like a building or an object or a landscape, to where it's not utilized. It's being kept there. We don't get to use it. We get to stand from a distance and see it there. So there's a difference there. And so the Wild Sheep Foundation is a hunting organization, and there's a lot of thoughts on, wait, how can hunters be conserving wildlife? For many people, it doesn't make sense. And so what I'd like to do is walk you through how at least one organization, the Wild Sheep Foundation, does this. These are just some of the main ones out there. They're each passionate about something. Pheasants Forever, they love pheasants. They love to go out there and chase pheasants and hunt pheasants and eat pheasants. And so how do they do that to actually try to bring more pheasants back? So let's look at some ways that groups like the Wild Sheep Foundation has done that. So in 1850, these are the best estimates we have based on those early explorers on where bighorn sheep lived in North America. In the 1960s, that was the low point of bighorn sheep. There was diseases, right? Ranchers that brought in domestic sheep, habitat loss. All the best places to live, humans live. Right? Reno, Nevada. I know where Jesse Beck is, Roy Gom, Collin Ranch. Those schools are great habitat for deer coming down in the winter months. Now they get hit on McCarran Boulevard up there. And so we take over a lot of great areas. We like those areas as much as the animals do. Competition, we brought in cattle, and they eat a lot of the native plants. And so those limited bighorn sheep. And then predation has always been there. Mountain lions, wolves, those type of things. Those have been fairly constant going through there. So it was in the 1960s. Sorry, let me back up here real fast. It was in the 1960s where sheep hunters said, hey, we need to raise money for wild sheep. And they started a little banquet dinner, raising money, and then taking that money, giving it to Department of Wildlife agencies to try to get sheep in ranges where they used to be. One thing that the Wild Sheep Foundation is doing this year is a conservation award for youth. This is brand new. We're going to award it next year at the Sheep Show. If it's something you're interested in from this experience, our goal here is really to encourage conservation of whatever. It doesn't have to be wild sheep, but it's going to be presented to a 7th to 12th grader next January. You can apply through we have some local chapters here, Nevada Bighorns Unlimited. The winner can get outdoor experience up in Wyoming with their family. But that's one little way. I wanted to throw that in there quickly. That's brand new. We're just announcing that here this week. So wild sheep transplants. So since 1922, over 22,000 sheep have been captured and moved somewhere else and let them go. That's over 1,500 transplants. What that does is populations do well in some areas and not others. Down by Las Vegas, we have the Muddy Mountains. It's like something magical. The population just doubles and doubles and doubles, but it reaches that point where it can't anymore. There's so many offspring and not enough food that naturally you hit a carrying capacity and some of those animals die off from starvation. And so what we do is we hire Department of Wildlife, we hire public helicopters, we fly in there, we capture sheep by helicopter mainly now, and we bring them back down, we put them into trailers, drive them somewhere where there used to be sheep and let them go. This was the first capture in Nevada in 1968, a little different than by helicopter. And here is what that looks like. I might have to adjust the volume here. So what you're going to see here is Department of Wildlife. This is down by Las Vegas. The guy over there that has the net gun, they call him a muggle, kind of like a Harry Potter name. And what he does is his job is to shoot the net over the sheep. The helicopter pilot has to be amazingly talented because he's flying low to the ground. As soon as a sheep is captured by the net, the muggle guy hops out, and he has this little bag with him. And he will basically, first of all, start getting that sheep kind of swaddled up, almost like a baby. They'll kind of wrap it up. And if you've ever seen a baby and the mom or dad will put a blanket kind of tight around it, it calms it down. That's what he'll do here. So he gets out, he starts kind of getting the net off. They kind of swaddle it up, they put blinders on it, and then the sheep just kind of calms right down. They'll hook it up to the helicopter, and then they will pretty much start flying that down to a ground crew. And these are volunteers. You can actually participate in these. Department of Wildlife partners up with local chapters, and you can come out and help with this. And there's a whole series of vets. And what they want to make sure is none of these animals have OV pneumonia, right? No MOV, because it's the same thing as like COVID, right? We try to have that social distancing. The last thing we want is a student in your classroom who has COVID because it can spread so easily. This is just like that, right? We don't have a cure yet for COVID. We still don't have a cure yet for MOV. And we've been working on this for decades and decades and decades. We have 2 researchers who've been working on it. We've spent millions of dollars. We're getting steps closer, but we don't really have a cure except keeping wild sheep and domesticated sheep separate. So here he has a couple sheep in there. He's coming down. They're going to hook up another couple onto here. Now look how talented that pilot is. He's in a canyon. He's not going to land. He's going to leave the guy on the ground there behind, and he's going to fly these sheep. You'll see Lake Mead in the background. You'll see parts of Henderson or Las Vegas in the background in a second. There's some buildings back there. And that ground crew, the vets are testing them because if any of them have MOV, man, the last thing you're going to do is take them to an area where you're spending thousands of dollars to release new sheep and have them get sick and all die. And you'll notice he'll come down, and again, this helicopter pilot's talented. He'll gently rest that first sheep, and then the second and the third, and then he has a release latch. And as soon as he releases that third one, you'll see the whole ground crew, paid staff from the Department of Wildlife, paid veterinarians, and volunteers come out, and they are going to automatically just kind of start as quickly as they can doing what they need to do. You see the trailer over there on the side. They'll put them in there, and they start transporting them wherever they need. So early on, we didn't have a lot of sheep in Nevada. In the 1960s, we didn't have enough sheep to even have an accurate count. We don't know how many sheep because it just, scientifically, you couldn't get enough data to do that. So we started in Alberta, Canada, Wyoming, and Colorado, and we captured our Rocky Mountain Bighorn sheep, and we released them in those blue dot areas. California Bighorn, the yellows are where we captured those from other states. We moved those into Nevada. And then desert bighorn sheep, they were okay. We did have some desert bighorn, so we started capturing them from mountain ranges. Those are in the yellow, and then moving them to the blue. This is just through 2010. And then our population started getting so good, we started capturing them in Nevada and moving them to other states. So again, yellow is capturing them, blue is releasing them. And eventually you get kind of a Southwest Airlines map of sheep transplants. And this is only through 2006. And so a lot of effort goes into this, and it costs a lot of money. Here was one in 2020. This was just 2 years ago. It was January almost, or February, just north of Winnemucca. And the sheep are a little timid. This is the release right here. And as soon as the first one goes, you'll see the others will just start flying out. It also gives you perspective of how big they are. We think they're as big as deer. Look at them compared to the humans. They're much smaller than deer. And that truck in the background, there was one in there that wasn't doing so well, and they weren't sure what was going to happen with it. It ended up doing great. It rode in the back of a pickup truck that had special medical stuff on it. The vet kind of rode with it, and it came right back, did awesome, and was released as well there. One of our most recent ones was just out by Pyramid Lake I think about a year ago. It's the first time they did anything out there with the reservation and had a great release out there. So on that last one I showed you, Thursday cost about $40,000 to do that, and Friday was about $72,000. There isn't money from taxpayers or an organization to donate really to this. $9,000 had to go to Endow salaries, their travel, vehicle costs, maintenance, gasoline, things like that. The rest of that was really paid by hunting conservation groups. Nevada Bighorns Unlimited in Reno paid 70% of that. That's a big chunk of money to go to 2 days of getting sheep there. Fallon has a chapter. Nevada Muleys, they're not even a bighorn sheep group, but they're passionate about wildlife, so they even donated some money. The Chucker Foundation, that's a bird, about the size of a chicken. They donated money as well. So another translocation was, this was up in Montana. Here's some pictures of that one. Again, this is a year ago. This was last winter. Same deal. You can see they take the science. That has a double decker, so they can put a whole bunch on the bottom and then a whole bunch on the top. They stay together, and it's kind of like you feel comfortable when you're around your friends. And so they kind of keep them together there. You can see the blindfold one on. Right there, that's where they're doing the swab and stuff. Just like if you've ever had the COVID test where the thing goes up your nose. Not fun, right? But it's effective. Exact same stuff that happens right here. Also, a lot of times we want to put a radio collar on a sheep. So to move one sheep, the general cost is about $4,700 to move one sheep. Again, a lot of fees kind of associated with that. A couple years ago, a volunteer came up with an idea of take one, put one back. So they said, oh, you know what? A lot of members of the Wild Sheep Foundation are trying to figure out ways to give money, but they want something directed. And they're like, well, if it costs about $5,000 to transplant a sheep, let's put it out to our membership and say, hey, if you've shot a sheep and you want to try putting one back on the mountain, give $5,000. We'll give you an ear tag that says one on it, that you've put one back on the mountain. And so we have this all the way up to people, given $5,000, $10,000. Since 2014, 226 people who have in their lifetime harvested a sheep for their family to eat have given over $1,200,000 just in that one program. If we look at Nevada's trap and transplant, it went from less than 3,000 in 1980 to over 10,100 desert bighorns. California bighorns were now at about 1,900. And again, we really didn't have those in the 1960s through the 1990s. And then about 310 Rocky Mountain bighorn. Again, that goes up and down from year to year. Guzzlers. Has anyone, by raise of hands, seen a guzzler out when you're hiking? Yeah, most people are like, what is it? What do you mean guzzler? What does that even mean? So Nevada is like one of the driest states in the nation, and water is that limiting resource besides food and space and shelter. And so they depend on this water. So what a guzzler is an artificial catchment system. So this is a picture. That is like a roof, and it sticks about a foot off the ground. That's a really big one. And when it rains on that roof. It's slanted, so the water goes down to a rain gutter, just like on your house. And then the rain gutter goes underneath to an underground tank. So here's a tank. That's a giant one they're putting in there. And it stores that water. And then by gravity, it goes to that sheep on the left. There's just a little, like a dripper system in a sense, that tank stays full as long as there's water in the big tank. So anytime it rains, it refills this, and it keeps the water from just soaking into the ground, and that allows there to be water for those bighorn sheep when we have these droughts, and we've had some bad droughts. Here's a small game guzzler. I was out hiking, this was last January, and I came across this one, and it's a small one. I mean, they fence it off a little bit just so you don't have like wild horses walking on it, things like that, and it just rains on that little thing, and then there's a tiny dripper, and quail and grouse and rabbits can get under there. That one would not be for bighorn sheep. That's specifically a small game guzzler there. Guzzlers help all sorts of wildlife. So these are just some pictures from game cameras that have captured bats and mountain lions and hawks, bobcats coming into them. In Nevada, we have 1,747 of those. Funding comes predominantly from conservation groups. The average cost is $25,000 for a large game guzzler. Now, if you have to fly it in by helicopter because it's a remote area, that ups the cost another $10,000. We've had issues with drought in Nevada, and last spring, we had this plea. I was at a chapter banquet, as actually last summer, it was in June, and our chapter in Southern Nevada called up where we were meeting in Idaho and said, look, we have an issue. We have the driest year in Southern Nevada we've ever had. We've never, ever had to fill guzzlers in June, ever. Sometimes in August, they'll have to get a helicopter, dip it in Lake Mead, and make it artificially rain just to fill a guzzler. Well, they found 2 guzzlers that were 100% dry, and the sheep were hanging out there, and they found 16 dead sheep around one guzzler, and another had 20 dead sheep. And they called up, they knew this meeting was going, they're like, look, we need money, and they tried raising that. So we had 3 years ago this happen in northern Nevada, and we were finding sheep. They weren't dead, but the lambs weren't leaving, and they were looking like they're going to start dying in the next day or two. And since that time, we have a special reserve of $40,000 to help out. The problem was this one was costing $105,000, $750 an hour for Department of Wildlife helicopters. And then they didn't have enough, so we had to do private helicopters as well, which was $1,000 an hour. But between June 4th and 14th, they hauled 35,000 gallons of water to all those different guzzlers. And to give you an idea, the kayak pool out there is 10,000 gallons when it's full. And so that's a lot of water to haul by these little tiny buckets to put in there. Research is a big deal of the Wild Sheep Foundation. Again, that MOVI. We've spent over $2 million now. This data is a couple years old, and we don't have a cure. Horn plugs. So, difference between hunting and poaching. So there was an issue back in the 80s, 90s, even today, poaching is happening where people go out and kill animals without legally doing it. So the process now is if you harvest a ram, you have to take it into Game and Fish. They drill a hole in the back, and they glue in, epoxy in this specific tag. And the Wild Sheep Foundation, back in the 1970s, was known as FNAWS, Foundation for North American Wild Sheep. They came up with this idea, and since then, they fund these horn plugs for all sheep around the world now. And so if someone hunts, there's a number. It'll say like NV for Nevada, and then it'll have a number, and that's associated to that person. So they know they've legally taken it, and it's just kind of like a license plate for a car. Separation in Nevada, these are different places where there are both bighorn sheep and domestic sheep. This is where we have issues with diseases spreading. So part of our deal is trying to work with ranchers. We had one 5 years ago who came to us and said, look, I've been in ranching my whole life. My kids want nothing to do with it. I'm going to sell my grazing allotment to someone else. Would you like to buy it? Because I'm passionate about the outdoors and bighorn sheep too. If you buy it, no domestic sheep can come on it. So we worked out a deal and we purchased that from the rancher. But a lot of it's just conversations taking place there. Wildfires, right? We have a ton of wildfires in Nevada. 2017, we had 768 of them. 2018, we saw the largest fire in Nevada's history. You heard about California last year. We've had schools shut down, right? 2 years in a row because of wildfires. So it can take 25 to 30 years basically to have sagebrush, one of the key aspects of wildlife, grow back. You get these non-native plants like cheatgrass growing in, and Nevada Bighorns Unlimited will put out and get volunteers to come, and volunteers come with these little baskets. They go out to sagebrush around the state and hit them like with tennis rackets, and all the seeds drop in. And then Nevada Bighorns Unlimited will pay Department of Wildlife helicopter to go fly over those areas and drop the sagebrush seeds so that it can get established before those invasive weeds can. One of the final things I want to talk about is state wildlife agencies. Nevada Department of Wildlife, less than 1% of all of their funding comes from taxes. That's about $500,000 to $800,000. The rest comes from matching grants through volunteer hours and hunting licenses. So these are the most recent data of how much money. This is what funds the Nevada Department of Wildlife. This is what funds our wildlife management in our state. $23 million just in 2021 came from licenses. If I want to hunt deer, I have to buy a license, so that costs me so much money. Then I have to put in for a tag, and that costs me money. And they might say, yep, not enough tags, you can't get one this year. I don't get my money back. If I get the tag, then I have to pay more money. And so this raises a tremendous amount of money that goes into wildlife conservation, and they still can't manage wildlife without those conservation groups chipping in and helping. Finally, bake sale. You're at what's called Sheep Week. Who's seen the commercials on TV for Sheep Week or Sheep Show on TV? They're on News Channel 4 all the time. You're in the youth component of that. We have people down the hallway from all over the world that this is what it's going to look like. Last night was the first banquet. That's the picture on the right there. Items are donated to the Sheep Foundation. We put them up for auction every night. We have breakfast auctions, we have lunch auctions, and we make a lot of money. About $4 million to $6 million in 3 days of like bake selling. And then we take that $6 million and we're a nonprofit and we have to spend it in 1 year. And so that's what we're all about, is putting and keeping sheep on the mountain. In the past 10 years, it's almost $50 million. We've done that by this one sheep show, 3-day event. So will it ever be the same? No. You know, the human population continues to grow in great, beautiful areas where wildlife also lives. We just continue to strive to have that management and conservation continue with that. So where we're going to head next is into our seminars.